Welcome to Thinkin, a podcast series by Kothapalli School of Public Policy.
Hello and welcome to Kothapalli School of Public Policy. This is Audumbar Chavan. You're watching our policy podcast, Thinkin. In this today's episode, we are going to discuss a very important topic, that is challenges of poverty reduction across the globe. Alleviation of poverty has always been a main policy agenda for the pursuit of sustainable economic development across different countries. There have been big strides in the last 30 years by various countries in an effort to reduce the prevalence of poverty. However, the scale of the problem is continuing to remain big. 1 in 20 still suffers from extreme poverty, even as global poverty rates have declined. Against this backdrop, we will revisit various ideals of poverty reduction, and to discuss this, I am delighted to have with us Dr. Rathin Roy. Dr. Roy is one of India's leading economists, currently the Managing Director at the Overseas Development Institute, London, and also the visiting faculty at Kothapalli School of Public Policy. Great to see you, Dr. Roy. Welcome back to Kothapalli again.
Thank you.
Thank you. So, Dr. Roy, in your lectures, you gave a very different perspective about the poverty. As an economist, you yourself have been practicing this issue, this topic for many decades. Do you think that has there been any change in which we think about poverty? Because when people talk about poverty, they think in terms of poverty, in terms of measure like per capita income. But we don't account for social identity like caste, race, gender. So that thinking has been the same, or is there any change?
Well, that's a very interesting question, Audumbar. My thinking has certainly changed in the last 35 or 40 years. I'm not so sure that the thinking of the economics profession has changed as substantially as mine has. The profession has begun to acknowledge what we call multidimensional poverty. And I'll be discussing that today in today's lecture as well. That there are many kinds of poverty you can have. Monetary poverty, that is income poverty, is only one of them. You can have poverty of infrastructure. You can have poverty of, let's say, education. You can have poverty of health. And you can be monetarily not poor, but you can still suffer from education poverty or health poverty. Or infrastructure poverty. So this much the economics profession has acknowledged. Unfortunately, the approach continues to be geographical. So now what they're doing is they're measuring multidimensional poverty. So most poverty analysis continues to be obsessed with counting the poor, measuring them, and identifying their characteristics. And then the solutions to poverty become things that are associated with an empirical diminution or reduction in those characteristics. So if you're infrastructure poor, you count the number of poor, infrastructure poor, and then you count next year how many are there, did it go up, did it go down. That is not tell you why a person who is not income poor is also infrastructure poor. And that is where the dimensions you mentioned come in. The social dimensions of caste, of class, of gender. So let me give you one example. In academia, there are very few Dalits. And in economics, almost no Dalits. I can count the number of Dalit economists I've encountered on my fingers of my hand. Would that translate into education poverty for Dalits? I think so. So the fact that you don't have Dalit professors, meaning then the gaze that a Dalit would have or could have is going to be very difficult for a Savarna to have. And therefore, if you don't have Dalits teaching, then you will not have that perspective taken on. And I think that is a major problem in public policy in India. Public policy in India, well, everywhere, but in India particularly we speak of, is upper caste dominated. And therefore the gaze is upper caste dominated. And therefore the obsession is with measuring and not with solving the problem.
So it's an issue of social capital or access to privileged information.
It is an issue of social capital. It is an issue of cultural capital also. Absolutely.
So we know that there are multiple strategies for poverty reduction. Classical economists, they say, have a sustained economic growth, invest in health, education, have a decent social protection. I will come to that later. But one of the important strategy that is reflected in the policies of the nation is macroeconomic stability. That has been mainstreamed in the last 30 years, because 1990 was a period from then onwards, 1990 to 2015. This is a golden age of poverty reduction. So what do you think of, what do you make of this macroeconomic stability, like having fiscal prudence in place, controlling the inflation?
Well, all these are good things for growth, but it is not automatically true that lack of macroeconomic stability does not result in reductions in poverty. And the most easy example I can give you is our neighboring country, Nepal. So Nepal has not had any kind of stability since they shot their king. Then they've had Maoism, they've had separatist movements, they've had elections. There's been a period of extreme political instability and macroeconomic weakness. But Nepal in that same period has experienced the highest rate of poverty reduction in Asia. Extreme poverty in Nepal now is much lower than the neighboring states of UP and Bihar. And their per capita income is higher than UP and Bihar.
Sorry to interrupt you. Why is it so? Because India is a democracy and Nepal is an authoritarian monarchy.
I don't know.
How does poverty react to the political regime? That's my question.
I don't know, but I know that it is not automatically true that if you have a quote-unquote good political regime, that is both either necessary or sufficient for poverty reduction, as the example of Nepal shows.
Okay. Yeah. So, in your lecture, you also mentioned about the equalization of poor and non-poor when it comes to consumption and investment through redistribution intervention, like redistribution of asset. Why has that failed in India? Because we see a lot of schemes like giving credit to poor for buying asset like cow and sewing machine. Has that not been successful in India, despite there has been a lot of effort for microfinance?
Yes, and the conclusion I have to draw from that is, well, let me start by saying, we know that the poor are very good creditors, borrowers. Rate of default of a poor person on a loan is much lower than the rate of default of Adani or Nirav Chokshi.
Yeah.
That we know.
Yeah.
So we have to ask ourselves, why, if we give the poor assets, are they not able to take advantage of these assets and grow them? Part of the reason is the caste system. The ability of somebody who is not an upper caste person to deploy an asset in the most entrepreneurial way, I speculate, I don't know, is possibly more limited than the ability of an upper caste person with their networks, because economics in this country has a lot to do with networks.
So you are touching upon the access to land resource.
Not just access to land, and when I give you land, do you have the complementary networks to be able to grow a crop and make a profit with it? Do you have cash flow issues which you can resolve in your biradri? I would say that a Brahmin is far better able to resolve these cash flow issues than a Dalit is, because Dalit biradri has no cash.
Yeah.
And if those who have cash are unwilling to lend to Dalits or give them cash in more expensive terms, are unwilling to buy from Dalits or are willing to buy from them only on cheap terms, then obviously the ability of a Dalit to be a profitable entrepreneur is reduced. Certainly, I think caste is a major impediment, and the counter example I'll give you is the relative success of the dairy movement across India. So Patels, while not Dalit, in Gujarat, who were the backbone of the Amul cooperative movement, are Shudras by caste origin, right? But one, because of a higher, superior rate of social organization in Gujarat, thanks to the Swaminarayan movement. Two, through exposure to the rest of the globe, through consistent emigration from British times. And three, through their organization by Dr. Kurian in Anand, in the Amul cooperative, they were able to overcome the social barriers to upgradation. It wasn't just Amul, it wasn't just emigration. All these things have happened elsewhere. Biharis have emigrated to Mauritius. But that has not been sufficient for them.
And that has not happened even in Maharashtra.
Yes, in Maharashtra actually it is very odd. In Maharashtra you have very relatively higher levels of empowerment of the, I can speak about that state since I am from it, of the backward castes within the Varna system, but extreme disempowerment of Dalits.
Yeah.
It's very interesting, the contrast. So, and that is partly because Shivaji Maharaj was, mostly was from Marathas are OBCs, Mahars are OBCs. And therefore, that is the very reason why there was a Brahmin revolt in a sense and the Peshwai came. The mysterious disappearance of Shahu Maharaj and Sambhaji Maharaj and the sudden rise of the Maharashtrian Brahmin in Pune, reflected a sort of caste struggle, which is often glossed over. But the fact remains that the very existence of Marathas as an OBC group has meant some empowerment to OBCs, but not to Dalits.
Yeah. So let's touch upon another state, that is Tamil Nadu. They have this Dravidian movement that is led by Stalin, and he's trying to revive that. What do you see the issue of poverty there?
Tamil Nadu has performed extremely well, as I will tell you later today, on poverty. Its poverty, extreme poverty in Tamil Nadu is, I think, less than 2% now.
All attributed to Dravidian model of social justice?
Not all attributed to it. I would say attributed to 2 or 3 things. One, superior forms of social organization and cooperation. 2, the democratization of politics and the democratization of religion. It's not as if there's no discrimination against Dalits in Tamil Nadu. There's huge discrimination.
It is there, yeah.
But that discrimination has been sought to be actively limited by the Dravidian movement, which has created a sense of mutual solidarity. So that discrimination is far less impactful of access to education, which means less education poverty, access to infrastructure, which means less infrastructure poverty, and therefore has impacted, I think, extreme income poverty in a number of profound ways, added to the fact that Tamil Nadu has been a state that has seen economic growth in the best possible way, which is through a rise in the share of manufacturing. Manufacturing happens in Tamil Nadu. I would say now as much as in Maharashtra and elsewhere. And manufacturing is both inherently profitable in terms of its creation of good quality jobs, inherently demanding of good quality skills, and inherently democratizing.
Yes.
Very difficult if you sit on the shop floor of Tata Steels or of Hyundai to practice untouchability.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
So manufacturing needs democracy, and that democratization has helped. In addition to that, complementary social protection measures, which have been in place in Tamil Nadu now for 20-25 years. Midday meal scheme was originated there.
Yeah.
The Amma canteens for urban workers were originated there. Investments in healthcare originated there. Rise in literacy happened there. So all these good things happening together have impacted poverty by impacting the drivers of poverty, in which, as you rightly point out, the impact on regressive social forms through political mobilization and social mobilization has played a very important role.
Yes. Let's go back to the debate of poverty at the global level in contemporary times. We see that there has been a decline of global poverty until pandemic hit. So, as an economist, what is your assessment of pandemic? Is this experience of poverty same for developed countries and developing countries? Is there any convergence?
I am very worried about this. It's not a good thing to converge. A rich country should not be converging to poverty levels of poor countries simply because they're rich. But they are. Let me give you an example. In the country in which I now live, the United Kingdom, children do not get free midday meals. In India, they do. So, child deprivation and education poverty is rising in England. There's lots of evidence of it. It's a reasonably free press, so things are not suppressed. That children are going to school hungry. They are ashamed in front of their peers when they are told that their parents did not have the money in the pandemic to pay for their school meal. So they don't go to the counter at all. Because they are hungry, they're not able to concentrate on studying. Their nutrition goes down, and they're in a terrible state. Whereas in India, if you go to a public school, government school, you get a free meal. Bus. There is no means testing. So I think
this is something extraordinary in a country like UK.
It is also happening to healthcare in France. It is also happening to young deprived people in Spain. It is happening across the United States. So and this is something the developed world should really worry about, because high levels of per capita income coexisting with systems that do not pay attention to the universal provision of a minimum set of things necessary for people to be able to exercise their capabilities. That state of affairs is now existing even in rich countries, and therefore what all the pandemic has done is brought that to the fore.
Yeah.
I think there has to be a fundamental rethink of policy in rich countries, because it is not acceptable that you are rich and people in your country, even if they're a minority, their state of living converges to that or is even inferior to that of people in poorer countries. It is certainly not acceptable. It should not be acceptable to any British citizen that the deprivation of a British child with a per capita income of $44,000 is greater than the deprivation of an Indian child with a per capita income of $2,000. That is just unacceptable.
Another important point that often economics talk about, that investment in human capital, health and education, giving an access. And yesterday you were talking about the affordability. So how it is proven that access is not enough?
It is very surprising to me always that economists of all people should be worrying about affordability. It is pure hardcore economics. And we know for a long time, but we seem to suppress this, that poor people pay higher prices for the same thing as rich people. I have known since the age of 25 that to get the price of access to a liter of drinking water in a slum in Dharavi, Bombay, is higher than the price of a liter of drinking water in the city of London, PPP.
Yes.
It is much higher than the price of a liter of water in Malabar Hill, which is the richest neighborhood of Bombay.
Yeah.
Everybody celebrates C.K. Prahalad's, I'm not saying that he didn't do a good thing, shampoo and soap sachets.
Yeah.
You go to a village, you'll find they're buying 10 gram soap, 5 gram shampoo, the same as they provide me in a 5-star hotel, the same size.
Yeah.
But the unit cost of that soap and shampoo for poor people is 10 times more than the unit cost I pay when I buy a full liter of oil or a full shampoo bottle or a big bar of soap. The poor face higher prices because they are not cash rich, because they do not have depth of income. That means therefore that they have to buy smaller quantities, the unit cost of which is far more expensive. So the proportion of money that the poor end up spending on basic needs becomes higher, not just because they are poor, but also because they are forced to buy more expensive things. This is a major driver of poverty. And the only countries that have any approach to solving it have been ex-communist countries, because they had supply chains which made sure that prices were equalized. We also had them once upon a time. We had things like cooperative stores. These things have gotten destroyed. And with the abandonment of rationing, which is not a bad thing, but we forgot one other thing that rationing did was equalized affordability between the poor and not poor. We all paid the same price for a kilo of sugar. That equalization is gone, and that is now a major driver of poverty, I think, in countries like India especially.
So how difficult it is to ensure affordability when the state is ruling back and there is a rise of private sector? I'm not going into that binary between public sector versus private sector, but
it is difficult to assure affordability because we are not thinking about the problem. If the state is rolling back, then the market that replaces it has to ask a question, which is, what is causing the poor to buy these things in smaller quantities? And what can I do about it? One important way in which you could resolve this is through some financial engineering. So if I know that your total consumption of soap is X over the year, and if you're able to pay me for that total consumption of soap, let's say that a household, my household, let's say we consume about the same amount of soap as a poor household, because we all have the same bath and we all had at the same time. Let's say that I spend 500 rupees a year on soap. But that guy, because he's not able to buy 50 rupee soaps or 100 rupee soaps, is buying 10 rupee soaps and therefore he's consuming 700 rupees a year on soap. The first step is, how do I equalize that? You could have a subscription model where you get the soap at the same price I pay for it, except you pay for it in installments across the year. That would mean a lower profit share for the rich, but that would probably be, I don't even know it would be lower profit, because then the kind of supply chain you will need to build will be very different from the kind of supply chain needed to send out shampoos and sachets. This is called engineering.
Or process innovation?
Process innovation. But our great unicorns only want to do Swiggy. Because India is a decadent country and we ignore our biggest market, which is to increase affordability and thereby increase output and thereby increase profitability. Nobody wants to be in that business. And therefore, it's not just a withdrawal of the state, it is the incompetence of the Indian private sector and their satisfaction and pride they get from sending 10 rupee sachets that is driving the problem.
Yes, absolutely. Now let's go back to the global experience, like Asian miracle that we see from 1960 to 1980, the kind of growth they had. The same experience is not reflecting across different continents. So the typical model of having high income and exporting manufacturing stuffs. So why only East Asian countries are successful and why not India?
Well, the East Asian countries were successful because they had a supply chain process where until China, countries were, it started with Japan. And Japan received massive amounts of aid after the Second World War to industrialize. And then the Japanese in the 50s and 60s began producing cheap products. And then as the Japanese upgraded, they transferred their manufacturing to Korea and Taiwan. Then as the Koreans and Taiwanese upgraded, they transferred their manufacturing to China, and that blew the whole bucket open because China has the biggest population in the world. So as long as China was able to respond to that demand, slowly they began to take it over, not just from the Taiwans and the Koreas and the Chinese, but also from the Africans and the Indians and the Germans. China today makes Ganesh Murtis. China today makes rubber ducks for German children. So that was a process that was part of a continuous whole. Now, there is no intention on the part of the Chinese or anybody else to replicate that process elsewhere. The only other country in which that process could be replicated is India. But India does not seem to have the ability to deliver the kind of supply chain, logistics, and human capital that a mass transference provides. So what you are seeing to some extent is a partial replication of that in the next two sunrise economies of this continent, which are Vietnam and Bangladesh.
Yes.
You are seeing some attempts to do this in East Africa, particularly Rwanda and Ethiopia, but those attempts are fragile. Essentially because the African continent continues to be viewed as a place of extraction. And Latin America, unfortunately, has been extracted from for its primary commodity production for so long that wage rates are too high for them to be competing on wage labor. Possible exception is Mexico, and it is getting a lot of investment that China used to be getting. But really no other country will be able to compete at that level and scale. So the answer to your question, therefore, is one, there was a historical process in Asia which was underpinned by American willingness, one, to see Japan grow, and then to see free market economies in Asia grow. That process, and then in their haste to turn China into a free market economy, China benefited from a spurt.
State-led capitalism.
Yeah, all these countries had state-led capitalism, and but when China benefited, they basically knocked everybody else out of the business. So now you're getting partial clawbacks, and Vietnam, Mexico, etc. Why you're not getting it at scale in Latin America and Africa is very familiar. Both places produce natural resources and commodities. The primary interest of the powerful countries is to extract these natural resources and commodities from these places, and that will always be given precedence over industrialization. So, for example, electric car batteries, the most important ingredients are cobalt. Cobalt is mined in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Not a single car battery is made in the Democratic Republic of Congo. There is no intention to make them. And I cannot think of a better example of heartless extraction from the African continent, despite it being the youngest continent. Rather than investing in manufacturing there, countries, including India, are playing the extraction game.
Yes. I just wanted to touch upon the point that South Asia, you mentioned about the Bangladesh. South Asia has always been volatile in terms of political and social stability is concerned. So except India, what do you see the future of these countries like Pakistan, Nepal and Bangladesh, particularly Bangladesh, because you've been there?
I think Bangladesh has potentially a very bright future. But they have to be careful and they should learn from us. No country that promotes hate and division within its borders prospers.
Absolutely.
No country.
Including India?
No country. Spain did not prosper under Franco. Forget about Hitler. What I'm talking about is petty tyranny and winning political votes rather than offering the value proposition is not prosperity, but division, exclusion and hate. That is what Spain suffered for 50 years, and when that stopped, Spain grew. That is what Portugal suffered for 70 years, and then that stopped, Portugal grew. That is what Philippines has suffered for many years and continues to suffer. That is what Thailand suffered for many years. That is what Egypt suffered for many years. That is what Pakistan suffered for many years and continues to suffer. Bangladesh has a choice. to try and promote shared prosperity ideas, and I was very impressed by the fact that certainly on the women's empowerment side, Bangladesh was fairly well empowered. They will need to invest in state capacity to complete their development transformation. I see that happening in bits and pieces, and they are helped very much by the fact that they have very active social movements like BRAC and the Grameen experience to sort of help the state along in its growth pattern. They have managed to get rid of the Pakistan legacy of military dictatorship finally. But civilian governments continue to be, I think, unnecessarily insecure about voices of dissent and opposition. So they will have to learn, I think, to deal with dissent and opposition better and build the state and continue to make an offer of prosperity. The big advantage they have over India is that their human development indicators are much better than India today. Of course, their GDP is higher. And women's empowerment is a very important part of the Bangladesh success story, by which I mean very simply, I said earlier that manufacturing is a very democratic workspace. Women in Bangladesh are employed in massive numbers in manufacturing, because Bangladesh's growth has been powered in substantial measure by manufacturing. And so Bangladesh needs to take advantage of this manufacturing dividend and women's empowerment to build a more inclusive society that is interested in the joint project of transformation, not in the joint project of exclusion.
So do you see any linkages of Muhammad Yunu's work for this women empowerment?
I think all the Bangladeshi elite have a major role to play in the economic transformation of Bangladesh. And my experience with many countries that have taken successful steps in the development process is very often the objective has not been development but national survival. Even in India, the word development did not enter the textbook of India, of Indians till 1970 or 1965. We were concerned with building a state and a nation which Mr. Nehru described as a nation in the making. The national project was one to build a country where everyone worked together to keep it whole and safe, and that coming together rather than looking for enemies inside meant that you would do basic things which in Hindi we call Marathi sarvajanik. Education, food. So sarvajanik means nobody should go hungry. We have succeeded in that. Bangladesh has also succeeded in that. So that sarvajanik impulse is very, very important for a successful development transformation. Divisional approaches to things, whether Hindu Muslim, whether upper caste, lower caste, whether female male, whether north south, impede the sarvajanik impulse and therefore impede the ability to dream, conceptualize and execute a common project of prosperous transformation.
Absolutely. I think that sets you apart from other economists, because generally economists, they don't touch upon these issues of Hindu Muslim or hate or social stripe in the society. Very few economists speaks upon that. Thanks for that. We are into the final segment of this episode. So what do you think about this international financial architecture which is supported by World Bank and IMF for because we can see the $1 billion aid is given to the African countries and even developing countries. Isn't it performing well?
Firstly, it's not true that aid is not the major financial flow that the international financial architecture organizes to developing countries. Loans are. And that is why you see so many debt crises happening in so many poor countries. As an economist, I can tell you that if you have things like global public goods, like climate, poverty, if you accept these are global public goods, access to basic human development, then you can't lend money to people to provide global public goods, right? That has to come through a sarvajanik impulse that all human beings are entitled to not dying of starvation. What has happened is that aid now mainly goes to countries in crisis, and loans at a lower rate of interest, so-called concessional loans, inform much development spending. And we saw this in the case of the pandemic. It was very sad, I think. I'll give you a good example and a bad example. So in the case of the pandemic, a very simple thing that the rich countries could have done, or the international financial architecture could have done, is bought up the intellectual property rights on vaccines, bought up the entire global supply of vaccines, and made sure that they were equitably distributed across populations. The world failed to do that. Contrast that with HIV/AIDS, where the response was a collective response, and today we have won the battle against HIV/AIDS.
Yes.
So HIV/AIDS was a global public good, was treated as a global public good, and therefore was financed by the international financial architecture as a global public good. COVID and vaccines were not. The responses were deemed to be most appropriate at the national level, which then meant that the American got priority vaccine over a Bangladeshi.
And same could happen for climate change.
Climate change is profoundly unsatisfactory state of affairs, because what we are financing is, in the name of financing climate change, is an energy transition. We are not financing climate change by financing changes in ways in which we protect the environment and protect the globe in its planetary boundaries. So we are not asking. So let me give you an example. If you are only interested in the energy transition, then whether I use 1 unit of energy to air condition this room or light up a light bulb of a child who is trying to study, I don't care. Both are produced by solar. So I become basically indifferent to the purposes to which energy is used. And the entire climate community, unfortunately, not all of them, and India has been very firm on this, at least our climate intellectuals, our climate scientists. But then people say you're obstructive. Our point is that what you use energy for matters as much as the source of energy. That's a profoundly important problem, and the financing of climate change as a global public good must be about financing things that energy is used for, not financing a transition in the use of energy.
Yes.
Transition in the use of energy today, I'm not just talking about rich countries, also rich people in poor countries. You know, today's biggest fossil fuel billionaire is who? The Ambanis. Tomorrow's biggest renewable billionaire will be who? Ambani. Today's biggest fossil fuel billionaire as a country is who? Norway. Tomorrow's biggest climate billionaire will be who? Norway. Today's biggest car manufacturer, Ford. Will tomorrow be biggest car manufacturer electric vehicles? The argument whether cars are bad for climate change and we should move from cars to public transport is silent. How to make cities more democratic and thereby reduce the carbon footprint? Silence. How to improve biodiversity so that people who live in areas where biodiversity is needed are rewarded for looking after biodiversity as a GPG and see an increase in their prosperity, thereby benefiting climate. Ignored. Biodiversity is in fact dealt with in a separate COP from the climate COP.
Yes.
So this unimodal focus on energy is basically an attempt to perpetuate existing production and consumption lifestyles, even by doing very well. That the reason we have a climate problem is our production and consumption lifestyles. In that sense, I think I'm very happy to be an Indian. There are many reasons today when I feel troubled about my country. But on climate and on the international financial architecture, I think there is multi-partisan consensus, and I am very much part of it.
Yes. So, as an economist, do you think that the global trajectory of poverty will be dented by climate change? Just a small brief answer.
Climate change will not create poverty, it will create human misery and suffering. First in vulnerable places such as small island states, landlocked countries that are close to like Nepal, the Himalayan melt, Arctic melt. All these phenomena will no doubt affect developed countries, but the most and developing countries. But the most concerning thing is that given that we're almost certain to miss the 1.5 degree target, we will have to spend money on adapting to climate change. That's expensive.
Yeah.
And because it is expensive, the ability of poorer countries to adapt to climate change is going to be more difficult than that of rich countries, which is why my friend Avinash Persod and Mia Motley, the president of Barbados, Prime Minister, have argued in something called the Bridgetown Initiative that we take the power games of the world today as given. Let us use whatever minor amount of grants you want to give for loss and damage, consequences of climate change. For adaptation, since it is an expensive business and no capitalist is interested in making money from adaptation, it's very difficult to make money from adaptation. Let us try and get concession finance. And for mitigation, which is big business and very profitable, for Adani, for Ambani, for British Petroleum, for all the Seitlok, let us get private sector financing. That's a division of labor they produce. I completely support it. I'm unhappy that that's the best we can do, but on looking at the track record on climate for the last 20 years, globally powerful people, whether they live in rich or poor countries, are not going to change either their production and consumption patterns or their desire to make money out of providing these things to allow us to dream of a different, more equitable world to do it. So I'm afraid the Bridgetown Initiative is going to be the best solution we can have in the absence of political mobilization against the current system of production and consumption which the world is cursed with and which has caused climate change.
So before we conclude, what is your advice to the public policy professionals? How do they should look at the poverty issue? What should be the thinking?
On the poverty issue, I would say, number one, do not take a partial preferment. Number one, do not just measure poverty. Identify the drivers of poverty. If you measure poverty, you will never be able to come to the affordability point I showed you. Number two, don't go for stereotypes. Like good democracies have lower poverty. Number three, focus on writing up, first thing, a list of the causes, not even the causes, I would say the drivers of poverty. In India, it could be caste. In Kenya, it could be lack of access to fresh water. In Bangladesh, it could be population density. In Kerala, it could be the opposite, which is population density, a good thing. So what drives poverty? What are the things that drive poverty? And there would be things that you can fix and things that require the system to fix. So for example, if women's disempowerment drives poverty, then you have to fix the system in terms of you'll have to have an empowerment strategy. But if the problem is very simply just lack of affordable drinking water, then we can come up with financial engineering and financial solutions, right?
Absolutely.
So the solutions should depend on the driver, not on the empirical observation of poverty or its measurement. That is the best advice I can give you, and that is exactly what a public policy professional should be doing better than an economist or a geographer, who of necessity and training will take a partial approach.
Absolutely. With that, we are concluding today's session. Thank you, Dr. Roy, for putting things into perspective. This has been a very insightful session. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you
so much.